I still remember the night I held the keys to my first house. The living room was empty, the floor cold beneath me, and through the window I could see only grass, but in my mind it was already a garden. Roses, lilies, and water lilies floating on a pond. For the first time in my life, I felt something was truly mine. But that joy carried a shadow. Because as I sat there with the keys trembling in my hands, memories crashed back in memories of being 18 at my parents' kitchen table, when my mother told me I had to pay $400 a month just to stay in my childhood bedroom. Memories of eating stale sandwiches in college while my sister Patricia enjoyed Stanford fully paid for. Memories of being invisible, overlooked, second best. That night, in the silence of my new home, I finally understood my life had been shaped not only by what I gained, but by what my family denied me. My name is Kate Adams. I'm 29 years old, and I still wake up at night haunted by the feeling that I spent my whole life invisible in my own family. Every morning, staring into the mirror in my tiny Houston apartment, I see a woman who lived nearly 3 decades in the shadow of her older sister, Patricia, who is now 32. Patricia was always the golden child every parent dreams of. Our parents and my father Robert Adams and my mother Margaret Adams lit up with pride whenever they spoke about her. She was smart, charming, and confident. She knew how to talk her way out of anything, and people not only forgave her mistakes but admired her cleverness. I, on the other hand, was always the independent one. That sounds like a compliment, but in my parents' language it meant something else. It meant I was the daughter who would manage on her own, the one who never needed help. It meant I was expected to handle the hard work quietly, solve problems, and never ask for attention. From the earliest age I felt the difference, and it burned inside me. When Patricia had a birthday, our backyard in suburban Houston turned into a carnival. My parents rented bounce houses and carousels. Once they'd even brought in a real pony for the children. Families filled the yard. My mother ordered a massive cake from the city's best bakery, and my father filmed every second with his camcorder. I remember standing at my bedroom window upstairs, pressing my face against the cool glass, aching with a loneliness too deep for a 7-year-old to understand. I wanted to cry, but I already knew that tears were pointless. No one would notice my sadness when Patricia, glowing in her pink princess dress, had the spotlight. And my birthdays? A completely different story. A modest dinner at the kitchen table, take-out pizza from Tony's down the street, and a discounted cake from the supermarket. No guests. No balloons. No memories worth filming. Kate doesn't like big parties, my mother would explain to the few relatives who asked. She prefers something small. But nobody ever asked me what I wanted. Nobody imagined that maybe I too wanted to feel like a princess for just one day. Christmas mornings were especially painful. Patricia unwrapped lavish gifts at the full Barbie dream house with the elevator, the pink convertible, the latest bicycle with tassels on the handlebars. I got hand-me-downs or cheap imitations. I still remember the year when I was 8 and received a dollhouse with no elevator, flimsy furniture, and one wall taped together. My parents watched me expectantly, waiting for gratitude, and I forced myself to smile. "You don't need expensive toys," my mother said whenever she caught me glancing at Patricia's presents. "Be grateful for what you have, not every child gets even this." But Patricia was never required to perform gratitude. If she complained that her bike wasn't the right shade of pink, my parents promised to replace it. When I once said I wished my dollhouse had an elevator too, my father frowned and lectured me about appreciating what I had and not comparing myself to others. That unfairness burned me from the inside. Every morning I hoped things would finally change, that my parents would notice me. And every night I went to bed with disappointment. School only made it worse. When Patricia brought home a C in math, my parents hired her a tutor and reassured her that effort mattered most. When I brought home A's and B's, the best I got was a distracted "good job." When Patricia quit piano lessons, the lessons my parents had paid thousands of dollars for, my mother sighed and said, maybe music just isn't her calling. When I asked for computer programming classes that cost a fraction of that, my father shook his head. "Why bother? You are already doing well. Don't spread yourself too thin." So I learned to swallow the hurt, to smile, to celebrate Patricia's victories as if they were my own. Stop expecting praise. Deep inside, I grew certain that I was second best to the backup daughter, the one who was loved differently by default. The real breaking point came when I turned 18 and it was time for college. I had worked for 4 years preparing. While classmates went to parties, I studied. I was the editor of the school paper, a volunteer at the local animal shelter, a debater, a math club member. I woke at 5 in the morning to study and stayed up until midnight with assignments. It worked. I was accepted to the University of Texas at Austin, one of the top public universities in the country. My heart pounded with pride as I held the acceptance letter. Finally, I thought this would make my parents as proud of me as they were of Patricia. I planned to live at home my first year to save money, about $15,000. I pictured my mother hugging me for being practical, my father praising my sense of responsibility. Reality was harsher. One Sunday evening in late spring, with the family gathered for dinner, I explained my plan. My mother's reaction hit me like cold water. "If you're staying here, you'll have to contribute," she said, as if I were a tenant, not her daughter. Contribute meant paying $400 a month to live in my childhood bedroom. $400 in a house they already owned. Plus groceries. Plus laundry. At 18, with a part-time job at YSL Books paying $9 an hour, it felt impossible. Working 20 hours a week, I would clear about $600 a month after taxes. $400 to them, leaving $200 for food, books, clothes, transportation, everything. $200 to survive as a college student. Something inside me cracked. Quietly. Like thin ice breaking underfoot. I realized then I would never be what Patricia was to them. I was the backup daughter. The one expected to figure it out. But you know what? I did figure it out. And that was only the beginning. I tried to explain to my parents how absurd and unfair their demands were. My voice trembled with both despair and anger as I reminded them that they had covered every single expense for my sister Patricia at Stanford. She never once had to worry about money, not even for food or textbooks. My mother listened with a stone face and then shrugged a small gesture that spoke louder than words. She told me that Patricia was given what she needed and that I was different, independent, and therefore I would manage on my own. Those words hurt more than any insult could have. In them was the entire truth of our family dynamic. Patricia was their precious princess to be cherished, protected, and indulged. I was the workhorse expected to handle everything alone because I was the strong one. In that moment I realized any further conversation was pointless. My parents had already decided, and my feelings, my needs, my financial situation did not matter to them. I was an 18-year-old girl hearing from her own parents that she was not worthy of the same treatment as her sister. And yes, I did manage, but at a terrible cost. The next 4 years became a test of endurance that changed me completely. I worked at YSL Books as many hours as I could squeeze in without failing my classes. That often meant standing behind the register from 7 in the morning until 11 at night on weekends when the store was flooded at the start of the semester or during holiday sales. The store manager, an older woman named Laura Sanchez, pitied me. Sometimes she let me take expired sandwiches from the cafe. Those stale sandwiches were often my only real meal of the day. I still remember the taste of dry bread, wilted filling, but back then I was so grateful for those scraps of kindness that I nearly cried with relief. Every morning, walking to class at the University of Texas, I passed the campus Starbucks. The smell of fresh coffee and pastries was torture. I watched classmates casually buy lattes for $5 and courses for $3, and envy pressed so hard on my chest it was hard to breathe. $5 was nearly a third of my daily food budget. Instead, I lived on peanut butter sandwiches I made in bulk at home for the week and free instant coffee in the break room at YSL. The coffee was bitter, watery, with the taste of cheap powder, but it was hot and it was free, and that was enough. Textbooks were a nightmare of their own. While other students bought the latest editions from the campus bookstore, I spent hours hunting second-hand websites, chasing older editions at clearance sales, or sitting for days in the library copying chapters by hand. My notebooks were filled with such tiny, cramped handwriting that sometimes I couldn't even read my own notes. And every month, like clockwork, I counted out $400 to my parents for the privilege of living in my own childhood bedroom. I left the money in an envelope on the kitchen table because I couldn't stand handing it over directly. It was too painful to see the satisfaction on my mother's face as she counted the bills. Meanwhile, Patricia lived at Stanford like a princess. My parents paid not only $70,000 a year for tuition, but also a luxury dorm room, unlimited dining plans, textbooks, even a gym membership on campus. On top of that, they sent her $1,200 every month for pocket money and more than twice my entire monthly income. I remember one December during my sophomore year, Patricia called to complain that the air conditioning in her dorm wasn't strong enough and she had to sleep in light pajamas instead of something warmer. She whined as though this was the greatest hardship in the world and expected me to sympathize. That same day, my old Honda Accord, the one I had bought secondhand for $1,500, finally broke down in the university parking lot. The air conditioner in that car hadn't worked for 3 years, and I couldn't afford the $800 repair. In winter, the car was freezing. In summer, it was a sauna, but it was my only way to get between home, school, and work. And my sister was crying about an over-efficient air conditioner in our comfortable dorm room. My parents contacted Stanford Housing and arranged for Patricia to be moved into a different dorm with a modern climate control system. Meanwhile, I drove home from work in an ice-cold car, wrapped in an old jacket, wishing at least the heater would come back to life. Every month my parents sent Patricia her allowance and sometimes extra for unexpected expenses. Once I overheard my mother on the phone with my father while he was on a business trip. She said Patricia needed another $500 for a new winter coat because California turned out colder than she expected. My mother said they didn't want Patricia to be cold because college was stressful enough already. I stood in the doorway holding a plate of cheap noodles, my dinner at night, and felt that familiar stab of pain. Why was it unacceptable for Patricia to be cold, but perfectly fine for me? Why were her inconveniences emergencies, but mine were character-building? That winter, during my sophomore year, my only warm coat finally fell apart. The cheap fabric tore, the zipper broke, the lining stuck out in several places. I walked across campus in November winds wearing only a thin sweatshirt, shivering as icy air cut straight through me. For the first time in 2 years, I broke my rule and asked my parents for help. I stepped into the living room where my mother was watching television and quietly told her I desperately needed a new coat because mine was ruined. She looked at me and said I was 20 years old and should learn to plan my expenses better. If a coat was important, I should have saved for it. 20 years old, and I was told to budget for a coat. Patricia at 22 got $500 in a single transfer without questions or lectures. I ended up buying a coat at a thrift store for $30. It didn't fit properly, too wide in the shoulders, too short in the sleeves, and it smelled faintly of someone else's perfume. But it was warm, and that was enough. By the end of my junior year, I knew I could no longer silently endure this injustice. I couldn't keep pretending it didn't matter that my parents spent thousands on Patricia's comfort while lecturing me about independence when I asked for $30 for a coat. The moment of truth came in the spring of my senior year, before final exams. Patricia graduated from Stanford, and my parents threw her a party so extravagant the entire neighborhood in Houston talked about it. They rented a giant tent for the backyard, hired catering from the city's best Italian restaurant, Mamma Mia's, and brought in a professional DJ. More than 100 guests came with relatives, family, friends, neighbors, Patricia's old classmates. My parents ordered a towering cake from a pastry chef who usually baked for Texas millionaires' weddings. My father spent the evening snapping photos of every moment of his eldest daughter's triumph. My mother bragged non-stop about Patricia's success at one of the best universities in the world and her bright future ahead. Patricia glowed in a new $1,000 dress, smiling for photos, accepting congratulations and gifts. I stood in a corner in my only decent dress, a simple black one I had bought at a discount store 3 years earlier, and felt like a stranger at my own family's celebration. No one asked me about my studies, my plans, my future. All attention was on Patricia, as always. That night my parents spent nearly $12,000 on the party. I know the exact amount because I overheard my father boasting about it to the neighbors. $12,000, 30 times what I spent on food in an entire year. 2 months later, it was my turn to graduate. My family marked the occasion with a quiet dinner at home. My mother baked a frozen lasagna from the supermarket and said there was no need to make a big deal out of it. Patricia was too busy to attend as she had a job interview at an advertising agency in Dallas, arranged through my parents' connections. I sat at that same kitchen table where 4 years earlier they had set the terms of my rent, and I stared at my diploma in computer science, earned with honors. 4 years of sacrifices, sleepless nights, skipped meals, and all I got was cold lasagna and polite congratulations. Looking back, what hurt the most wasn't the lack of financial support. It was the constant reminder that I simply wasn't as important to them. Patricia was always their shining star, their daughter with endless potential. I was just the one who existed beside her. Even when I succeeded, it was ignored or taken for granted. My parents always said, "Kate is smart, she doesn't need help." In our family, being capable felt like a curse. The better I managed on my own, the less attention I received, the more they assumed I would always be fine. After graduation, I moved out as quickly as I could. I couldn't stay another day in that house filled with years of humiliation and neglect. I rented a tiny apartment in Midtown Houston near my first job at an IT company called Techno Solutions. It wasn't easy. My starting salary was only $42,000 a year, and rent for a small one-bedroom took nearly half my income after taxes. But I finally felt free of their expectations and constant comparisons. For the first time in my life, I could eat what I wanted, buy myself a cup of coffee, spend my money without having to explain every dollar. The first months on my own felt like a breath of fresh air after years of suffocation. I remember walking into Starbucks near the office and buying a $5 latte I had dreamed of for 4 years. The taste wasn't magical, but the moment meant everything. I was no longer the broke student who couldn't afford real coffee. I worked hard, lived frugally, and slowly began to save. I had a plan, changed jobs every year and a half or 2 years, climbed the career ladder, increased my salary. It wasn't easy in the conservative Texas IT world, where women had to prove themselves twice as much as men, but I was ready for the fight. In 7 years after college, I switched jobs 4 times. From junior programmer at Techno Solutions, I grew into a senior systems analyst at Global Finance Group. My salary climbed from $42,000 to $75,000 a year, a fortune compared to the $9 an hour I once earned at the bookstore. Meanwhile, Patricia's life took another turn. She married Brandon Mitchell, a charismatic 34-year-old man my parents adored from the start. Brandon was handsome, charming, and could light up our room. But behind the charm was a responsibility. In 8 years, he held 7 different jobs as car salesman at Houston Motors until he clashed with his boss, personal trainer at Fitness Force until he quit over weekend shifts, realtor at Texas Homes until he realized selling houses was harder than he thought, an online supplement business that collapsed after 4 months, manager at Texas Traditions restaurant until he quit after 3 months, consultant at Best Buy until he was fired for being late, and now a delivery driver at Quick Delivery, always chasing the next big opportunity. Patricia and Brandon had 3 children, Emma, age 6, Jacob, age 4, and baby Chloe, age 2. Beautiful children, but their arrival only deepened the family's financial struggles. Brandon never kept a job long enough to provide stability or health insurance. Patricia hadn't worked since Emma was born. And as always, my parents stepped in. They didn't just help her, they financed Patricia's entire life. Every month they sent $800 for basic expenses. When their old Ford Explorer broke down, my parents gave them $40,000 for a new Honda Pilot. They paid for Emma's daycare, the family's medical bills, even their weekly groceries. I wish I could say it no longer bothered me after all these years, but that would be a lie. No matter how much I achieved on my own, promotions, financial independence, professional recognition, I always felt like second place. My parents' logic never changed. Kate is strong and will manage. Patricia needs help. It didn't matter that Patricia was older than me, that she chose a husband who couldn't provide, that she had 3 children without any stability. All of that automatically became my parents' responsibility to fix. And me? I was the daughter who never asked for a dime after college, who built the career with her own hands, who never caused them trouble. To them, I was still just Kate, the one who would manage. A few years ago, I made a painful but necessary choice. I stopped sharing the details of my life with my family. I realized they weren't truly interested. Every time I tried to talk about my achievements at work or my plans, the conversation turned back to Patricia and her struggles. My accomplishments were taken for granted, her problems required immediate attention. So I created a boundary. My career, my dreams, my relationships all became my private world. It hurt to admit that my own family couldn't be a source of support, but it was the only way to protect myself. And then recently, I decided it was time for the next big step. For 5 years, I had rented a tiny one-room apartment in a converted Victorian house in Midtown. It was barely bigger than a hotel room. The kitchen had only 2 burners and a mini fridge. The bathroom was so small I had to choose between using the sink or the shower. But it was mine, my sanctuary, where no one told me how to live or spend my money. After years of sacrifice, I have finally saved enough. In the early years, I managed only $300 or $400 a month. Later, I saved $800 or more whenever bonuses or freelance work allowed. By the time I turned 30, I had built a nest egg of $62,000, enough for a down payment on a modest home. Every single dollar had been earned by me, every bill soaked in sweat and sleepless nights. And finally, I could tell myself what my parents never once told me: Kate, you deserve this. It was time to buy a place of my own. But here's the thing I chose not to tell my family. And soon you'll understand why, because with my parents, nothing can ever be only about me. In our family, absolutely everything turned into a collective project where the main beneficiary was always my sister Patricia and her family. But there was something I never shared with my parents because I knew they would not understand. They would twist my dream into yet another way to help Patricia. I had a secret, cherished dream I carried for years, the true reason I wanted a small house with a large yard, not a giant mansion with a 3-car garage. I wanted to create a garden. Not just flower beds of petunias or neat lawns like every other house in the neighborhood. I dreamed of a real, painterly garden, the kind Claude Monet created at his estate in Giverny. I imagined meadows of irises and lilies, tall delphiniums above seas of poppies, every corner breathing beauty and harmony. That dream was born in college, when I first saw reproductions of Monet's paintings in an art history textbook I borrowed from the Library for General Education course. I was sitting in a stuffy classroom, exhausted after another shift at Wise Owl Books, when I stumbled across the series Water Lilies. Those blurred, shimmering strokes, the play of light and shadow, the tenderness of the colors, it struck me like lightning. I stayed in the library until closing, flipping through art books, studying photos of Monet's garden. The water lilies floating on a pond, the arched bridge covered in wisteria, the winding paths drowning in flowers, it was a world of beauty created by human hands. That day I thought for the first time, what if I could create something like that? Of course I knew I would never be a painter of Monet's level. I had no formal talent, no training, no time for serious study. But I could try to capture the beauty of flowers, the play of light in the leaves, the reflection of clouds in the water of a garden pond. I dreamed of taking painting classes, learning to mix colors to match the blush of a morning rose or the glow of an evening sky. In those years when I saved every penny, that dream was my secret comfort. Working at the bookstore, I would secretly flip through magazines on gardening and landscape design. I learned which flowers to plant together so something would bloom all summer long, how to plan a composition so each month a new color would appear. I studied which peonies opened in May, which roses bloomed until frost, how to plant dahlias so they form natural clusters. Between classes, I filled a battered notebook with sketches and diagrams, mapping out where I would plant everything in my future garden. At Bloom and Blossom, a flower shop near the university, an older Italian woman named Rosa Martinelli noticed my interest and began giving me advice. Sometimes, when she had flowers starting to wilt, she sold them to me for almost nothing. I would carry those bouquets to my tiny room in my parents' house and try to sketch them in pencil, dreaming of the day I could afford real paints. Rosa told me stories of her grandfather back in the old country who grew the most beautiful roses in his village and how he taught her to listen to what each plant needed. She told me I had the right eyes for a gardener, that I could see how colors blended and how light danced on petals. Those conversations were like oxygen in my suffocating college years. Whenever my parents dismissed my accomplishments or when I fell asleep hungry because I had spent my last dollars on textbooks, I closed my eyes and imagined my future garden. I saw myself walking along the paths at dawn with a cup of coffee in hand, inhaling the scent of roses and jasmine. I imagined sitting by a pond with an easel, trying to capture the reflection of clouds among the water lilies. I saw myself in an art studio, studying the techniques of the Impressionists, learning to mix paints to catch the tenderness of morning light on a peony petal. When I began working and saving, the dream grew more real. I calculated what it would cost to perennial seedlings, tulip and daffodil bulbs, annual flower seeds, tools, irrigation systems. It added up to a lot, but it was an investment for years to come. I started browsing houses not just for price or square footage, but for lot size. I didn't need a big house with 2 bedrooms. A small kitchen, a living room would be enough. But the yard had to be large enough to hold my dream. At least a 1/4 acre, preferably on the south side of the house for sunlight most of the day. I imagined transforming a backyard into a living painting that changed with the seasons: tulips and daffodils in spring, roses and lilies in summer, asters and chrysanthemums in autumn. At the center, a small pond with water plants, maybe even those same water lilies Monet loved. By the pond, I pictured a bench where I could sit with my sketchbook or simply enjoy the quiet beauty. In the garage or basement, I would create a small studio where I could finally learn to paint. I had even found weekend classes at an art center called Creative Horizons near my office. The lessons cost $150 a month, an amount I could finally afford. The teacher, Diana Collins, specialized in landscape painting and promised to teach the basics of oil. But for all of that, I needed a house with land. Not an apartment. And definitely not a giant suburban mansion where the yard would be filled with a playground and a 3-car driveway. If I had mentioned my plans to my parents, I knew exactly what would happen. They would immediately help me choose not the modest house with a garden I wanted, but something far bigger and more expensive for Patricia's family. I could already hear the conversations in my mind. My mother would say, "Kate, honey, why waste money on a tiny house with a garden? You're such a practical girl. Patricia is struggling so much with 3 kids in that cramped 2-bedroom apartment. Emma and Jacob share a room, and little Chloe sleeps with her parents. Imagine how wonderful it would be if you bought a big house where everyone could fit." My father would add his thoughts about real estate being a good investment, that homes in desirable neighborhoods only appreciate, that I shouldn't settle. And Patricia would insist children needed space to play, that they each deserved their own rooms, that a large kitchen was essential for family gatherings. And so my modest dream house with a garden would morph into a 4-bedroom suburban monster with a 3-car garage, a giant open kitchen, and a backyard turned into a play area. My quiet dream of mornings among flowers with a paintbrush would vanish under the weight of practical considerations. That is why I chose secrecy. I would stay silent until the very last moment, until the papers were signed and the keys in my hand. Only then would I announce my purchase as a done deal. But of course, that was too optimistic. In a small Texas suburb, nothing stays secret for long, especially with coworkers who treat gossip as a sport. I'm not sure exactly how the leak happened, but I suspect my chatty coworker Rachel Thompson from the IT department. Rachel was the kind of person who always pried into other people's lives and spread news like wildfire. Apparently at some party, or maybe chatting with friends, she casually mentioned that her colleague Kate Adams from Global Finance Group was house hunting. Rachel was incapable of keeping such things to herself. The trouble was, one of those friends or acquaintances happened to know Patricia's family, maybe a neighbor at the Spring Gardens complex where she rented, or maybe another parent from Emma or Jacob's daycare. In Houston's small suburbs, news travels like wildfire. Within days, the whole extended network knew. The very next day after I registered with a realtor site called Home Hunters, my mother called. Her voice was syrupy sweet, the kind of tone that always meant I was about to hear something unpleasant, sugar-coated in false warmth. She asked why I hadn't told them I was buying a house. She sounded genuinely hurt, as if I had committed a crime by keeping my own plans to myself. I tried to downplay it, saying I was only browsing and had made no decisions yet. I hoped to delay the inevitable confrontation. But my mother was already in battle mode. She told me she had discussed everything with Patricia, and they had wonderful ideas for me. When my mother and Patricia discuss my life, it always means the same thing: they have already decided for me, made a plan, and now expect me to obey. And sure enough, what came next confirmed my worst fears. My mother said I needed to think bigger and practical. Why waste money on a small house just for myself? It would be short-sighted. Far better to buy something large enough for the whole family. She reminded me of Patricia's cramped apartment with 3 kids. Emma and Jacob shared one tiny bedroom with a bunk bed. Little Chloe slept with her parents. Brandon had no office and worked at the kitchen table, adding to the chaos. According to my mother, I needed at least 4 bedrooms, one for each child, one for Patricia and Brandon, plus a guest room for my parents. A large kitchen dining area. A playroom for the children. And of course, the house had to be in a good school district near Spring Branch so Patricia's family could move easily. As she spoke, I felt that old mix of hopelessness and fury rising inside me. My dream of a small garden cottage was being turned into a solution for Patricia's housing problem. Nobody cared what I wanted. Nobody asked about my plans, my dreams, my vision for my own life. As always, everything became about Patricia. I tried to protest, saying this is my house and I was buying it for myself. I tried to explain I had needs of my own that had nothing to do with her family. But my mother brushed it aside with fake reassurance. Of course it's your house, dear. But wouldn't it be practical to use this chance to help everyone? She continued with her vision. The children would finally have proper rooms, Patricia would no longer suffer from lack of space, Brandon would work in peace, and my parents would see their grandchildren more often. And me? I would have a big, beautiful house in a nice area. Wasn't that wonderful? Besides, living alone was boring, while living surrounded by family would be so much warmer. I knew resistance was pointless. They had already decided, and once again my needs did not count. Only Patricia's. After that call, I sat for hours in my tiny apartment staring at the wall. My tablet lay in my lap, still open to a modest cottage I had bookmarked weeks earlier. It was a simple house, 15 minutes from downtown Houston, with 2 bedrooms, a cozy kitchen, and a living room with a fireplace. But what mattered most was the third of an acre lot on the south side, perfect for my dream garden. I already pictured planting tulips, daffodils, and crocuses in spring. Roses for summer, chosen to thrive in Texas heat. Asters and chrysanthemums in gold and orange for autumn. At the center, a pond surrounded by irises and daylilies, maybe a weeping willow bending over the water. And of course, water lilies, the same flowers that inspired Monet. But instead of that dream, I was being pushed toward a house full of children, noise, and demands that were never mine. I closed the real estate site and set the tablet down. At the time, I didn't realize it was only the beginning. The worst was still to come. What happened next went far beyond my darkest expectations after that painful phone call with my mother, where she explained exactly which kind of house I should buy to accommodate Patricia's family. Both she and my sister launched a full-scale campaign to find a right home. I am not exaggerating when I say they treated the search like a full-time job. Every morning, checking my email before work, I found at least a dozen new links to real estate listings with enthusiastic comments from my mother and Patricia. They even created a special group chat called House for Kate where they shared properties every day, complete with long descriptions of why each house was supposedly perfect for me. These listings looked like they belonged to another universe, one where money had no meaning and banks handed out loans with the snap of the fingers. Huge mansions with 4, 5, sometimes even 6 bedrooms, swimming pools bigger than my entire apartment, 3-car garages, and landscaping that cost more than my annual salary. Each morning I opened these links with growing dread, staring at price tags that made my chest tighten. $850,000 for a house in prestigious River Oaks. $1,200,000 for a mansion in Memorial Village with 6 bedrooms and a wine cellar. $980,000 for a so-called modest home in West University with 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and even a guest house. I sat at my desk at Global Finance Group, staring at those astronomical numbers, and felt crushed by helplessness. With my $75,000 annual salary, the bank would approve me for a mortgage of at most $200,000, and that was only if I provided a 20% down payment. The math was simple. Something any bank employee could explain in 5 minutes. With an income of $75,000 a year, my maximum monthly mortgage payment should not exceed $1,800. That meant a loan of about $180,000 to $200,000, including interest and insurance. But my mother and Patricia lived in a world where such details as income and bank requirements simply did not exist. They sent me houses worth $500,000 with the same ease someone else might recommend a new handbag. One morning, I finally lost my patience and tried to explain the reality of my finances. I wrote a long message in the group chat, detailing how mortgages work, what I could realistically afford, and how every one of their suggestions was 3 times my budget. Patricia replied within 10 minutes, and her words left me in shock. Well, Kate, you could just get a bigger loan, or ask for a raise at work, or maybe our parents can help with the down payment. The important thing is to think positively. I reread that message 3 times, unable to believe my eyes. Patricia, who had never held a steady job in her life and had no idea how banking even functioned, was advising me to take out a $500,000 mortgage. Ask for a raise as if companies hand out raises like candy. Get a bigger loan as if banks ignore credit checks and income requirements. Our parents can help, but the same parents who once forced me to pay $400 a month to live in my own childhood bedroom while fully supporting Patricia at Stanford. My mother chimed in an hour later with an even more outrageous idea. "Sweetheart, what if you took out the mortgage together with Patricia and Brandon? Then your incomes would be combined, and the bank would approve a larger amount." I read that suggestion and nearly fainted from outrage. She seriously proposed that I tie my financial future to Brandon, a man who had failed to keep a single job for more than a year in the past 8 years, and Patricia, who hadn't worked at all since her first child was born. I was supposed to attach my credit history, my money, my future to people who couldn't even provide for themselves. And worse, this meant the house would legally belong not only to me but also to Patricia and Brandon. They would gain equal rights to property paid for entirely with my money. If anything went wrong, if Brandon lost yet another job, or if they divorced, I would be stuck in financial ruin for years. I replied as politely as I could, "Thank you for the suggestion, but I prefer to handle this on my own." But my mother and Patricia weren't about to give up. Since I refused financial entanglement, they doubled down on sending me ideal homes. Now I receive 15 to 20 links a day, each one with detailed descriptions of how the house would solve all of Patricia's family problems. Look at this one: 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a huge kitchen, and even a maid's room you could turn into a playroom for the kids. Here's another perfect choice near the best schools, only 30 minutes from Brandon's work, and plenty of space in the yard for a trampoline. To Kate, "You simply must see this one. It is a separate guest suite where our parents could stay whenever they visit to help with the children." Every message felt like a knife to the heart. They weren't just ignoring my financial limits. They were ignoring me. My wishes, my dreams, my vision of my future meant nothing. Nobody cared that I wanted a small house with a garden to grow flowers and learn to paint. Nobody cared that I longed for peace and quiet, not a house full of chaos and noise. Worst of all, they didn't even pretend this was about me. Their descriptions were entirely focused on Patricia's convenience, of where her children would sleep, where Brandon could work, where my parents could stay. I existed only as the bank account and the formal owner of the property. After 2 weeks of this siege, I realized I could no longer bear it. Each morning my phone exploded with notifications about amazing opportunities, and every night I fell asleep with a panning headache and a sense of helplessness. I tried one more time to explain my position, this time more directly. "Mom, Patricia, I appreciate your help, but I am looking for a small house for myself. I do not need 5 bedrooms and 3 garages. I want something modest within my budget." Patricia's reply came instantly. "Kate, don't be so selfish. You can see how my kids are living. Don't you care about your nieces and nephew?" That accusation cut straight to the bone. I truly love Patricia's children, Emma, Jacob, and little Chloe. They are wonderful, smart, kind kids, and yes, it hurt me to know they lived in a cramped apartment. But why was it my responsibility to solve their housing problem? Why couldn't Patricia and Brandon find a way to provide for their own children? My mother quickly added her voice. "Sweetheart, we only want the whole family to be happy. Isn't it wonderful when everyone lives close and can help one another?" But I knew exactly how one-sided that help would be. I would pay the mortgage. I would maintain the house. I would handle the problems. Patricia's family would simply enjoy the benefits. And if anything went wrong, who would be left with the debt? Me. At last I made a radical decision. I muted the House for Kate chat and stopped replying to their messages. When my mother called with her great ideas, I politely said I was busy at work and promised to call back later, a promise I never kept. I thought they would take the hint and leave me alone. But I underestimated their persistence. After a week of silence, my mother showed up at my office. She walked past security and the receptionist, barged straight into my workspace, and staged a scene in the middle of my workday. "Kate, what is wrong with you? Why are you ignoring our messages? We are working so hard to help you, and you are acting like a spoiled child." Half the department heard her raised voice. My colleagues peeked over the cubicles with open curiosity. My boss, Michael Stewart, stepped out of his office with an irritated expression. Clearly family drama was not on his agenda for the day. I was mortified with shame and fury. My mother put me in an impossible situation. I couldn't throw my own mother out, but I couldn't let her humiliate me in front of my coworkers either. "Mom, please, let's talk at home. This is work time," I whispered, praying she would stop. But she refused. "No, we'll talk now. You have avoided us for a week. We found wonderful options, and you are blind to the opportunity." At that moment, I understood that politeness would never work. To my mother and Patricia, my gentle refusals weren't real. They thought I was just being difficult and would eventually give in. So I said quietly but firmly, "Mom, I will not buy a house for Patricia. I am looking for a home for myself within my own budget. Please stop sending me listings I cannot afford." Her face turned red with outrage. "How can you be so cruel to your own family? Patricia is desperate, the children are suffering, and you think only of yourself." Her words were so loud the entire office heard them. My cheeks burned with humiliation. Now everyone thought I was some selfish sister refusing to help her poor nieces and nephew. "Mom, please leave. We'll talk later," I said through clenched teeth, aware of every pair of eyes on me. But my mother wasn't finished. She pulled printed real estate ads from her bag and waved them in my office. "Look at this house in Sugarland, 7 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, a pool, and a jacuzzi. The children would have space to play, and Patricia would finally have a proper kitchen." Michael Stewart appeared in the doorway, his patience clearly gone. "Mrs. Adams, I need you to leave. This is work time, and you are disrupting the office." My mother turned to him indignantly. "Young man, I am discussing important family matters with my daughter. Then do it at home, not here," he said firmly. "Security will escort you out." I wanted the grunt to swallow me. After she was let out, I spent half an hour apologizing to management and coworkers. The incident became office gossip for weeks, and every time someone mentioned it, I felt like a scolded child. But even that humiliation didn't stop her campaign. Now she started calling me at work several times a day, each time with a fantastic new idea. Our secretary, Linda Garcia, passed me notes with apologetic looks. "Your mom called about a house on Kingwood Drive." I realized then that politeness was useless. My family saw my courtesy as weakness and only pushed harder. So I made a new plan. I would block the group chat, ignore their calls, and search for a house entirely on my own. Every evening after work, I drove to viewings, carefully avoiding neighborhoods near Spring Branch, where Patricia lived. I didn't want her friends or neighbors reporting back to my parents. I toured small suburbs outside Houston: Humble, Katy, Pearland, Conroe. These areas offered lower prices and larger yards. And the yard was my top priority, not the number of bedrooms or bathrooms. Most of the houses I could afford were modest ranch-style homes from the 1960s or 70s, often needing cosmetic repairs. That didn't scare me. I could paint walls, replace wallpaper, update fixtures. What mattered was sunlight and space for my garden. The realtor I worked with, a kind middle-aged woman named Susan Lee from Sunset Realty, didn't understand at first. "Kate, this house is so small," she said, showing me another 2-bedroom cottage. "Don't you want something bigger for a future family?" But I stood firm. I told her my dream was a small home with a large yard because I planned to build a garden. She shrugged, but she respected my request and kept showing me options. The search took weeks. Every weekend I spent at open houses, studying layouts, checking yards. Some were too close to highways, others shaded by tall trees, blocking the sun. Some required repairs that would drain my savings. Then one Saturday in late September, Susan showed me a house that made my heart stop. It was a small Cape Cod cottage in the woodlands, 30 minutes from my office. Built in the early 1990s, it looked like a gingerbread house with white walls, blue shutters, a red roof, a charming porch with a swing. Inside it was simple but perfect. 2 bedrooms, one for me, one for an art studio. A cozy living room with a fireplace. A small but functional kitchen with a window facing the yard. Everything modest, but warm and inviting. The true treasure, though, was the lot. Nearly half an acre on the south side, bathed in sunlight all day. The previous owners had planted only grass, but I already saw the garden in my mind. I pictured roses near the house, dahlias and coneflowers in clusters, asters and echinacea in the back, and in the far corner a small pond with water lilies in my own little giverny. Beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the yard, I imagined placing a bench and an easel. I would sit there with morning coffee, watching the light shift across the petals, trying to capture it on canvas. "How much is this house?" I asked, my voice trembling. $325,000, Susan replied. "The owners already moved out of state, so they're ready to negotiate." $325,000, exactly within my budget. With a $65,000 down payment, I would need a mortgage of $260,000, easily manageable with my salary. "I want to make an offer," I said, my hands shaking. That same day we filed the paperwork. I offered full price without negotiating. I was terrified someone else would snatch it away. The owners accepted the very next day. The following 2 weeks were a blur of mortgage approvals, inspections, and endless signatures. I was overwhelmed with joy, but I hid it from my family. Each night I sat in my tiny rented apartment, imagining life in my new home. Drinking coffee on the porch, planning flower beds, painting my first blossoms. I had already signed up for art classes at Creative Horizons starting in January. The teacher, Diana Collins, specialized in landscape painting and promised to teach oil techniques. By spring, I hoped to capture the first blooms of my garden. The day before closing, the bank officially approved my mortgage. I received the keys to my first home, the first property in my life that truly belonged to me. That night, I sat on the bare floor of my new living room, no furniture yet, staring out the window at the yard. Only grass grew there now, but in my mind I saw flowers, winding paths, a pond with lilies, a bench under the oak tree. For the first time in my life, I had done something entirely for myself. Not for my family, not for my parents, not to solve someone else's problem. This house, this garden, this dream, they were mine. All that was left was to tell my family the truth. I planned a family dinner the next week to share the news. I imagined their faces when I announced I had already bought the house, small, modest, and completely unsuitable for Patricia's family. But I underestimated their determination. What happened next went far beyond anything I could have imagined. I scheduled a family dinner for Saturday evening, telling my parents that I had important news to share. My mother was thrilled, clearly assuming I was finally ready to discuss buying a suitable house for the entire family. Patricia was equally excited and even offered to bring fresh printouts of real estate listings. All week before the dinner, I rehearsed my speech. I wanted to announce the news calmly, without emotions, simply stating the facts. I had already bought a house. It was small, it suited me perfectly, and nobody else would be moving in. I also planned to say that I was very happy with my choice and hoped my family would understand. But deep inside, I knew my hope for understanding was naive. The past months had shown me clearly my parents and Patricia were simply incapable of seeing my needs and desires as equal to their own. To them, I existed only as a tool to solve Patricia's problems. Any action of mine that did not serve that purpose was treated as selfishness, as a betrayal of so-called family values. On Saturday morning, I drove to my new house, and now I could proudly say my house to look it over again and convince myself I had made the right choice. Standing in the middle of the living room, gazing through the window at the lot where my garden would soon bloom, I felt a peace and certainty I hadn't experienced in years. This house embodied all of my dreams. Not grand, not ambitious, just human. The right to live the way I wanted. The right to create beauty with my own hands. The right to peace and quiet after years of living under constant pressure from family expectations. By 6 o'clock, I arrived at my parents' home. The house looked the same as always, but I felt different. For the first time in many years, I worked in not as a supplicant, not as someone seeking approval or support, but as an independent adult who had made an important decision and was ready to stand by it. The whole family was already gathered. Patricia sat on the couch in the living room, surrounded by folders filled with printed real estate ads. Brandon sprawled in an armchair with a can of beer. The children were not there, they must have been left with a nanny. My mother bustled in the kitchen, and my father read the newspaper, but I could see that everyone was waiting for my announcement. As soon as we sat down at the table, my mother began asking if I was finally ready to take the house search seriously. Patricia didn't even let me answer before she started describing yet another perfect option, a house in Sugar Land, priced at $1,200,000, with 5 bedrooms, a huge kitchen, and a pool. She was already making plans about how our parents would help with the down payment and how I would take on the mortgage. I cut her monologue short and announced that I had other news. I had already bought a house. The room went so silent I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Everyone stared at me with open disbelief, as if I had just announced I was planning to become an astronaut or move to Antarctica. My mother slowly asked what I meant. I repeated, I had bought a house, a small cottage in the woodlands. The deal had closed last week, and I already had the keys. Patricia's face went pale, then flushed red with outrage. She demanded to know how I could buy a house without consulting the family, how I could dare make such an important decision on my own. I replied that it was my purchase with my money, and as an adult with a steady job and my own savings, I didn't need anyone's permission to buy a home. My mother tried to regain control, insisting that such decisions must be made collectively, and began questioning me about the house. How many bedrooms was the space for the children? When I told them the house had 2 bedrooms, one for me and one as a studio, and that the yard was large enough for a garden, Patricia leapt from her seat. She screamed that I must have lost my mind buying a 2-bedroom house, and demanded to know where her children would live. I answered firmly, nowhere, because this house was for me alone, and I had not bought it to house our family. A heavy silence fell. I watched my parents and Patricia exchange looks, struggling to process what they had just heard. Their eyes showed disbelief, as if I had told them something beyond imagination. My father was the first to speak, accusing me of selfishness and asking what was wrong with me, since I had always been the reasonable one. I asked back, was I really selfish for buying a house with my own money for my own life? Patricia shouted that, yes, I was selfish. She reminded me of the conditions her children lived in. Emma and Jacob squeezed into a bunk bed in a tiny room, little Chloe sleeping with her parents. And me, she said, I had bought a house with a studio for painting. I asked what was wrong with that, and why I had no right to have a studio, why my hobbies were less important than her housing problems. My mother rose from the table, her face red with anger. She began declaring that family was sacred, and that when relatives had problems, we had to help, not think only of ourselves. So I asked her to explain why that help was always one-sided. Why, when I had problems in college, I had to manage alone, yet now I was obligated to solve Patricia's. My mother shouted that it was different, that I was young then and needed to learn responsibility, but Patricia had 3 small children. I coldly pointed out that she had those children while married to a man with no stable job, and nobody forced her to have 3 kids without the ability to support them. Brandon tried to protest, claiming that he worked hard and was trying to find stability. I cut him off, reminding him that in 8 years he had held 7 jobs, and I asked at what point he planned to truly start trying. Patricia was outraged, asking how I could speak that way to her husband. I replied that I was speaking the same way he lived off my parents' money while giving nothing in return. I listed the expenses, $800 a month in support, daycare fees, medical bills, $40,000 for a car, and asked how much longer he planned to live as a parasite on other people's labor. Patricia burst into tears, calling me heartless and repeating that we were family and must support one another. So I asked, where was that support when I ate expired sandwiches in college? Where was family support when I worked myself to exhaustion just to pay my parents for living in my own childhood home? Where was support when I froze in a broken-down car while Patricia complained about the air conditioning in her dorm room? My mother insisted I was exaggerating, that they had always loved me. I laughed bitterly and told them they loved only an idea of me, the convenient daughter who handled her own problems while solving others. But they had never loved the real me, with my own dreams, needs, and right to my own life. My father slammed his hand on the table, demanding that I stop the hysteria. He declared that I had bought the wrong house and that they would find a way to fix this mistake. I asked what mistake he was talking about, and he answered that I must sell the house and buy a proper one, something suitable for the entire family. I stared at him in disbelief. I told him I would not sell my house because it was the best thing that had happened to me in years. My mother firmly declared that I would, because they were my family and their opinion had to matter. At that moment I realized the conversation was hopeless. My parents and Patricia were not simply failing to understand my position, they flatly refused to accept it. To them, I would always remain a child, without the right to make my own decisions, especially if those decisions didn't serve the family's interests. I grabbed my bag and said I had spent 30 years living by their decisions about what was best for me. 30 years listening to what I must do, how I must live, who I must care for. And I knew where it had led to the fact that I only felt truly happy once I stopped asking their permission. I headed for the door, but Patricia ran after me, begging me to wait, insisting I couldn't just walk out because we were family. I stopped in the doorway and turned. I told her that family means everyone cares for one another, but in our family everyone only cared for her, while for me they expected only sacrifice. That wasn't family, that was parasitism. My mother shouted after me that I would regret this, that family cannot be chosen. I answered without looking back, that was true, but you can choose how much time to spend on toxic people, even if they are relatives. I got into my car and drove to my new home. My hands shook from adrenaline and pent-up emotions, but inside me spread a strange sense of relief. For the first time in my life, I had told my parents exactly what I thought. For the first time, I hadn't tried to smooth things over, hadn't apologized for my needs, hadn't compromised at my own expense. The following months were difficult. My parents and Patricia launched a full-scale campaign to force me to correct my mistake. They called every day, arrived without warning, even sent other relatives to pressure me. A priest from our old church even phoned to lecture me about family values. But I held firm. Every evening, returning to my cottage, I felt truly at home in every sense of the word. I began setting up my studio in the second bedroom, enrolled in painting classes, and planned my spring plantings for the garden. That spring, I planted my first roses, dahlias, and asters. By summer, the yard had transformed and no longer just grass, but the beginning of a true garden. Each morning, I drank coffee on the porch, gazing at the blooming beds, and I could hardly believe it was all mine. In my painting classes, I met wonderful people who shared my love of art and beauty. Diana Collins turned out to be a remarkable teacher, and I quickly learned the basics of working with oils. My first attempts to capture the flowers from my own garden were far from perfect, but each new painting brought me incredible joy. Gradually, the pressure from my family weakened. My parents realized I would not change my mind and shifted to other solutions for Patricia's housing problem. The last time my mother called me was 3 months ago to say they had found Patricia a larger rental apartment and were now helping her with the payments. Sometimes I feel sad that my relationship with the family never healed. I miss Patricia's children, whom I now almost never see. But I no longer regret my choice. For the first time in my life, I am living the way I want, not the way others expect me to. My garden grows and flourishes with each season. Next spring, I plan to create a small pond with water lilies in my own little Givany. And who knows, maybe one day I will learn to paint well enough to capture the full beauty of this place. Most importantly, I now have the time and the space for my dreams. And nobody can take that away from me, because for the first time in my life I belong to myself. It has been 1.5 years since that family dinner that changed my life forever. Today I sit in my garden early in the morning, sipping coffee and watching the first rays of sunlight fall on blooming roses. In my hands I hold a brush and a palette, trying to capture the play of light on the petals of the white roses I planted last spring. My garden has turned into a true work of art. Just last evening, I finished creating a small pond with water lilies, the very one I had dreamed of when I thought about Monet and his Givany. The water ripples softly, reflecting the morning sky, while irises and dahlias bloom along the edges, creating the exact picture I had imagined for so long. In my painting classes, I have made real progress. Diana Collins says I have a genuine talent for landscape painting, especially flowers. 3 of my works have even been shown in a local gallery as part of an exhibition for emerging artists. One painting, an image of my first roses at dawn, was bought by an elderly woman who said it reminded her of her childhood garden. Selling my first painting was an incredible feeling. Not because of the money, the amount was symbolic, only $150. What mattered was that someone wanted to hang the fruit of my work in their home, that my creation could stir emotions in a stranger. That was priceless. Over these 1.5 years, I have learned that happiness does not lie in the size of a house or the number of bedrooms. Happiness is being able to live according to your own values and dreams. Every morning, waking in my little cottage, I feel gratitude that at last I have space for creativity, for reflection, and for personal growth. Of course, there are moments of loneliness, especially during the holidays when I realize I am no longer part of traditional family gatherings. But this loneliness is entirely different from the isolation I felt within my family. Back then, I was surrounded by people yet felt invisible. Now I truly am alone, but for the first time in my life I feel whole. Recently I met my neighbors as George and Mary Williams, an elderly couple who live across the road. They have been together for 40 years, and they also have a beautiful garden. Mary shared seeds of rare delphiniums with me, and George helped me install an automatic watering system. This is the kind of support and mutual care I always imagined when I thought about genuine human relationships. As for my family, contact has practically ended. My mother called a few times during the first months, but I stopped answering. Patricia wrote me a long letter last Christmas accusing me of destroying the family and of depriving her children of their aunt. That letter hurt, especially the mention of the children. But I understood that Patricia still does not recognize her role in what happened. She continues to see the situation only as my ingratitude and selfishness, not as a natural reaction to years of neglect and attempts to use me to solve her problems. And that is fine. People change only when they are ready, and my family is not yet ready to acknowledge other people's boundaries. Sometimes I imagine how my life would have turned out if I had given in to the pressure and bought the big house my parents wanted. I see myself in a 5-bedroom home filled with Patricia's family, dealing every day with their problems and demands. In that life, I would have no garden, no studio, no quiet space for creativity. In that life, I probably never would have discovered that I had a gift for painting. I never would have felt the joy of creating beauty with my own hands. I would have remained the convenient Kate, the one who always managed and always helped others, but never lived for herself. That thought makes me value my decision even more. Yes, I lost family in the traditional sense. But I gained myself, my true self, with my own interests, talents, and the right to happiness. Now, telling you this story, I realize it is not only about me. Many of us live surrounded by people who love us conditionally only when we meet their expectations, only when we serve their interests. Family ties, friendships, romantic relationships all can become toxic if they are built on one-sided sacrifice. For a long time I wondered if I had done the right thing by breaking ties with my family. After all, we are taught from childhood that family is sacred, that blood bonds must be preserved at any cost. But now I know, no relationship is worth sacrificing your identity, your dreams, your right to happiness. Love should never require us to abandon ourselves. True love supports our growth, celebrates our success, and respects our boundaries. If relationships make you feel guilty for having needs, if loved ones treat your independence as betrayal, then maybe it is time to reconsider their value. It took me 30 years to learn a simple truth. I have the right to my own life. The right to choose how to spend my money, where to live, what to dream about. The right to say no even to relatives if their demands contradict my interests. That is not selfishness. That is healthy boundaries, without which real relationships are impossible. Paradoxically, defending your boundaries is not only respect for yourself, but also for others. When we are honest about our needs, we allow others to build relationships with our true selves, not with a convenient version of us. And now let me ask you, dear listeners, are there relationships in your life that demand you abandon your own dreams? People who love you only when you are useful. Maybe it is time for you to consider the price you are paying for that kind of love. Remember, you deserve relationships that nurture your growth, not ones that hold you back. You have the right to your own dreams, even if they do not fit into other people's plans. And most importantly, you have the right to happiness that comes from within, not from someone else's approval. Life is too short to spend it justifying your needs to those who will never understand them. Sometimes the most loving act toward yourself is the courage to choose your own path, even if it leads to solitude. But you know what? That solitude is not as frightening as it seems. Because for the first time in your life you are left alone with the one person who truly understands and accepts you yourself. And that, believe me, is worth any sacrifice. That's the end of today's story. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so share them in the comments below. I truly enjoy reading what you have to say. If you'd like more, check out the full playlist linked in the description of this video. New real stories are on the way, and I'd love to share them with you. Hopefully, I'll see you next time. If this journey resonated with you, please hit subscribe and tap the bell so you'll never miss the latest stories. Thank you for listening, and remember, even the hardest drama stories can end with freedom and dignity.